Well, like I said, we've been doing this college civil liberties tour, including on Tuesday night when there was a certain presidential debate happening. Did anybody have the misfortune of having to watch that? Well, you probably saw, depending on who you're voting for or not voting for, judging by the room, two guys who didn't mention any of the subjects that we're going to be talking about tonight. To my knowledge, and I went back and watched the debate, and I even watched some of the spin and analysis, civil liberties hardly came up. Well, when two guys agree completely on civil liberties, or the fact that we don't need them anymore, I guess it's not going to come up. You know, it was interesting. I'm a big movie buff. The movie, I think it was 2005 or 2006, The Departed, which won the Oscar that year. Very good movie, starring Jack Nicholson and Matt Damon, Mark Wahlberg, and Leonardo DiCaprio and others. There's a scene in that movie where Martin Sheen's character, he's playing a police officer, points at, this is during like a crime sting, he points at federal agents in the corner and he said, well, all the phones are under surveillance thanks to our federal friends over there. And Alec Baldwin walks up to another cop friend and puts him in a headlock and he says, Patriot Act, Patriot Act, Patriot Act. He was really excited that they could use what we're supposed to be, counterterrorism, post 9/11 legislation like the Patriot Act, for simple law enforcement. They were going after Jack Nicholson's criminal character, the gangsters. Now, at the time, that was indicative of two things. Number one, that things like the Patriot Act were being used for things far beyond terrorism. That's a problem in and of itself. Two, the partisan aspect of that. I assumed that the people making the movie, liberal Hollywood being what it was, that was sort of a dig at George W. Bush. Obviously, Alec Baldwin is a very outspoken political activist, and I assumed he wanted to get a dig in at George W. Bush. And rightly so. The Patriot Act is a terrible piece of legislation. Now we have Barack Obama, who campaigned to get rid of things like the Patriot Act, said it was wrong, said it was against American values, who not only has voted to reauthorize such legislation, but has outbushed Bush in that area. The National Defense Authorization Act is worse than the Patriot Act. If the Patriot Act says, well, you can spy on citizens, and you can lock people up without due process, Barack Obama now says you can lock up American citizens without due process, including on our own soil. Now, he's not the only person who has brought this up, and this is very scary, sort of the direction we're going on this particular issue and among other issues when it comes to civil liberties in this country. When the NDAA was being debated, Senator Lindsey Graham from my own home state of South Carolina wanted everyone to know, to be perfectly clear, that part of what the NDAA did was it designated the homeland, that's American soil, the continental United States, as the battlefield in the war on terror. When Bush was in office with the Patriot Act, the battlefield was overseas. We could do all sorts of extra and anti-constitutional things to people that were highly questionable. With the NDAA, Barack Obama promoted and Lindsey Graham promoted along these lines, the battlefield becomes home. Now, Lindsey Graham always told me during the Bush years, I had the opportunity to interview him on talk radio back in Charleston, South Carolina. I'd say, Senator Graham, why are we fighting these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan all these years later? And he'd say, well, Jack, you got to fight them over there, so you don't have to fight them over here. I heard that time and time again. Well, apparently now we have legislation to fight them over here. I guess those original ideas or plans did not work. Lindsey Graham also said, when promoting the NDAA, that when we arrest these people, including potentially American citizens, that we could say, this is a quote from Graham, quote, when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up, you don't get a lawyer. That's the constitutional conservative Lindsey Graham speaking there. Justin Amash, who's an actual Constitution conservative, called this, quote, one of the most anti-liberty pieces of legislation of our lifetime. And he is absolutely right. This is but one issue we'll be discussing tonight. And I want to introduce our first speaker. This is going to be discussing this issue of civil liberties from both a libertarian and liberal perspective. Our friend Bruce Fine was supposed to be with us tonight representing the conservative perspective. You might have heard he's fallen ill. We wish he could be here. He wishes he could be here, but you'll be glad to know he's doing well. He's fine. He just could not be with us tonight. But our first guest will be representing the libertarian view. Mr. Jacob Hornberger is the founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He received his BA degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. He was a civil and criminal trial attorney in Texas for 12 years and also served as an adjunct professor of law and economics at the University of Dallas. He used to be a regular commentator on the late, great Judge Andrew Napolitano's Freedom Watch on Fox Business. And boy, if there was ever a show I would want to come back, it would be that one for many reasons, but one of the biggest ones is that we could see my friend Jacob on TV all the time. Ladies and gentlemen, Jacob Hornberger.
Thank you. It sounds like we might have some libertarians in the audience. This is a good thing. Great to be here with y'all. As Jack said, that this is our 4th appearance this week on our College Civil Liberties Tour, which is really part 2. We did one last winter over on the East Coast, and it just was fantastic. It was just such a high, and we said, hey, why don't we do this again, and let's go out west. And it's just been fantastic, and to partner with the Young Americans for Liberty in this thing. I mean, what a great organization, and you guys have put these things together fantastically. You did it last winter, and then tonight and this week, and I know how much work goes into planning these things, and it's just so great for us to be able to just come in and have everything organized. And thank you for all the hard work that goes into this, and thank you for coming out this evening. This is an issue that we consider the most important burning issue of our time. And that's why we put together this program. You know, and we put it together with an interesting formula. We had a conservative, Bruce, who got sick and had to get operated on last night, so it wasn't just a mild stomach disorder, but he did fine. He went through major surgery, but he's in the hospital, but got out today. So unfortunately, he's not going to be here with us. And then we put together a liberal, Glenn Greenwald, who's both of whom are my heroes. And then, of course, me as a libertarian, and we got Jack, conservative libertarian, moderating this thing. And the idea was to communicate to y'all how important this is. And regardless of what your ideological perspective is. You know, because some people thought this was a debate. In fact, at 3 of the programs, people came up to me or before the program and said, can't wait for the debate. And I had to say, there is no debate. You've got 3 people here, 4 people, from different ideological perspectives, all of whom share the exact same perspective, with maybe some variations here and there, on these issues of civil liberties, the war on terrorism, foreign policy. And we just happen to believe that this is the most important issue of our lifetime, of your lifetime. Now, why is that? Well, let's examine that tonight. You know, when 9/11 hit, President Bush and the Pentagon announced as one of their very first acts was that they were going to establish a prisoner camp, an incarceration center in Cuba. Guantanamo Bay. They weren't going to do this in the United States. They were going to go outside the United States to establish this. Why? Why go into what really is a communist country that has an American imperial base there that stretches back to 1898? Why use that base for this incarceration center? And then as things developed and they we're turning it into a judicial center, and I put judicial in quotation marks, that this is a site where they were going to prosecute people for terrorism. And I thought to myself when all this was happening and developing, I said, you know, this is very interesting how this is going to turn out. And I had no doubts as to how it was going to turn out. But I thought, you know, this is going to be very fascinating because they essentially had carte blanche on the kind of system that they were going to put together. Because they said, you know, we're not going to be bound by the Constitution, that we're at war, we're not going to be bound by the Supreme Court, we're essentially a Constitution-free zone, we're independent of whatever's happening in the United States. This is going to be a Pentagon / CIA operation. And I thought, well, this is going to be really interesting to see how they put this thing together. And the reason that I had no doubts as to how they were going to put it together was because I had seen how the military and the CIA operated in the past in these kind of things. For example, if we go back to 1973, 9/11, 1973, and we look at what happened in Chile, we get a sense, a hint of what they were going to do at Guantanamo Bay. And this is the 9/11 of the Chileans. Okay, same day. It's really a remarkable coincidence. And what happened at that time was it wasn't a terrorist crisis as we had in 9/11. It was an economic crisis. And it was a crisis that had been precipitated in large part by the CIA. When Allende, a communist socialist man who was elected president of the country in a democratic election, fairly won. He gets in there and assumes power and adopts socialist policies. President Nixon said, "We can't tolerate this. This is another communist country in this hemisphere. You know, the communists are going to come and get us. You know, you know how you guys have been sort of college students here. Y'all have grown up with this sort of like the terrorist threat. You know, you were what, 8 or 9 or 10 years old when 9/11. So your teenage years, this is what you've kind of lived under. You know, the terrorists are going to come and get us, and you've got the color codes, and you're supposed to live in fear, and boy, they're going to take over our country. Well, this is the same thing that we had when we were teenagers. But it was the communists. The communists are coming to get us. They're going to come from Cuba. They're going to come from Nicaragua. They're going to come from Chile. And of course, you know, there was never any sense that there was this attack. I mean, we've had this embargo against Cuba, for 50 years? There was a CIA invasion of Cuba. There was assassination attempts on Castro. And there was never, ever any evidence that Castro or the Cubans were going to do anything aggressive toward the United States. In fact, the aggression has always been in the reverse direction. But it was this sense of fear again, you know, that Nixon says we can't allow this democratically elected president to win in Chile, so make the economy scream. And so the CIA goes in there and they do everything they can to make the economy spiral downward in Chile. And sure enough, there was huge chaos. And there were protests and demonstrations, crisis environment. And the crisis environment then produces a military coup. A military coup that was supported by the CIA, in which they participated. The U.S. military participated. Now, all secretly, and they denied it. They said we had nothing to do with this. But sure enough, the military takes over. And they oust the democratically elected president. And the military takes control to such an extent that they exercise emergency powers. And those powers consisted of the power to round up people that were accused of being terrorists or communists or both. And no trial. And they rounded them up, and tens of thousands of people. They tortured them. They sent them into secret military dungeons, military incarceration camps. They raped many of the women. They executed them. And included among the executed were 2 young Americans. A man named Charles Horman, who was around 24 years old. He was down there as a journalist. He was a liberal. He believed in a lot of the liberal stuff that was going on in the Allende regime. Another guy whose name escapes me, and another young American. They were executed without a trial because they were labeled by the military as communists. And of course, the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the CIA, denied having played any role in this, and they denied it for many, many years until some 25 years later, a document surfaces out of the State Department that says, uh-oh, we got a problem. Turns out that the CIA participated in at least the execution of Charles Horman. And that execution was the subject of a great film that I highly recommend to you called Missing, starring Jack Lemmon, famous actor, Sissy Spacek. Great movie. And that is called Missing. And it turned out that the CIA played a role in that execution. We still don't know what that role is because there was never an investigation. the Horman family sued, and the federal courts deferred to the military. They said national security is at stake, so they didn't need to require any accountability. To this day, we don't know what they did, how they did. We don't even know who the killers were, because there was this deference to the military, and it was the same deference to the military that the courts were doing in Chile under the Pinochet military dictatorship. Even today, I read in the paper that the Chilean Supreme Court has approved an extradition request to extradite a U.S. military officer during that time that was stationed in Chile for conspiracy to participate in the murder of those 2 young American men. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, to see if the U.S. government resists that extradition, which I'm almost certain they will do. But you see, it gets a sense when you see the military participate in this, our military cooperating with their military in the roundup of people and the denial of due process, no trial, torture, execution. And so I knew this had taken place on their 9/11. So when our 9/11 came along, that kind of gave me a hint as to what was going to happen. And we can go even more recently. We can go to the military dictatorship of Egypt under Hosni Mubarak. This is a military dictatorship that the U.S. government has long supported, 30 years, to the tune even today of $1.3 billion a year into this dictatorship. I mean, it's so ironic to see Hillary Clinton saying, oh, we're in favor of the Arab Spring, democracy spreading and all this. The U.S. government has been one of the greatest supporters of dictatorships in the Middle East. And I mean, I don't know who she thinks she's fooling. I mean, she's obviously trying to fool the American people who maybe don't pay much attention to these kind of things. But yeah, the U.S. government, the military, the CIA have been long partners with this military dictatorship, even to the extent that after 9/11, the U.S. government entered into a rendition torture partnership with the military dictatorship in Egypt, which enabled the CIA to kidnap people and then rendition them to Egypt for the purpose of torture. And the reason they chose Egypt as part of their torture partnerships, in addition to the Gaddafi regime in Libya and the Assad regime in Syria to serve as a torture partnership, is they knew that this dictatorship in Egypt was very good at torture. One of the best torture regimes in the world. That's why they chose them. And there's been long cooperation between the two militaries. Now, it might surprise you to know that when the protesters were protesting in Egypt under part of the Arab Spring, it wasn't that they were just only trying to get rid of Mubarak as the dictator. They were also, one of their principal demands was the surrender by the military dictatorship of this 30-year-old power that enabled the military to round up people without a trial, take them away to a military dungeon and torture them and even execute them without a trial. And this power arose 30 years before when they had an emergency, a terrorist emergency. There had been assassination of the president of the country. And so the military dictatorship said, this is an emergency. We need temporary emergency powers. And that temporary extended into 30 years. And this was fully supported by the U.S. government. This was a part of their war on terrorism that's lasted 30 years, temporary extended into 30 years. And those powers were being exercised over those 30 years. That whenever somebody got, too critical of the government, he was labeled a terrorist. And they would round him up, and they would cart him away and torture him. And that's part of what precipitated this Arab Spring. So this is another sign to me, is that when Guantanamo gets established and the military is going to establish this center, I said, okay, this is going to be interesting to see how they do this. But I had no doubts as to what they were going to do, because they had free reign to produce any kind of system they wanted. Now, in my opinion, the best thing to do when you're producing a system and you're an American is to, instead of looking to the Chilean dictatorship or the Mubarak dictatorship, or let's say even the Iranian dictatorship that the U.S. supported for some 25 years, in fact they installed into power, in Iran in 1953, when the CIA ousted the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, and installed a Shah of Iran, who exercised these same powers. That instead of modeling your system after these dictatorships, to me as an American, I would say, the best system to model a new system that you're creating is your own system. Jack mentioned that I practiced law. Glenn practiced law for many years. And we studied constitutional law. We practiced constitutional law. And, we got a lot of imperfections in our system. But by golly, there's no greater system in history than our constitutional system in terms of criminal justice. And so when you look back at what happened, at how our system came into existence, it's a fascinating story because, how did we get this federal government? We all were kind of born into the system, right? But how often do we ask ourselves, how did this federal government come into existence? When we just sort of accept it. It's here when we're born. It's here when we go to first grade. It's just there. But how did it come into existence? Well, it was called into existence by regular people like you and me. And those people, we the people, call this government into existence with the Constitution. And that's what called the federal government into existence. And let me tell you something. There were a lot of Americans that weren't very happy about it. They opposed it. They didn't like the idea of calling this federal government into existence. And why didn't they like it? Imagine Americans opposing the existence of a federal government, or the one we have now. Why did they do that? Well, because what they said, what their argument was, is that if you call this government into existence, it's going to turn into the type of government that's going to start rounding up people. It's going to cart them away to military dungeons, to concentration camps. It's going to torture them. It's going to kill them. And we don't want that. We don't want to live under that. We've lived under that. And they lived under it under a British king that would cart people away to the Tower of London to be tortured without any due process of law. They said, we don't want any part of this. And so they opposed this. Well, the response of the framers was, you don't need to worry about this because this is going to be a different kind of government. It's going to be different from every other government in history because we, the people, are going to tell the government what it can and cannot do rather than the reverse. People throughout history have been accustomed to government telling people what they're going to do and not do. It's sort of like the drug war, where the government tells you what you're going to ingest and what you're not going to ingest, and if you violate its orders, you're going to go to jail. Well, the concept that the framers said is, you don't need to worry about this. That the only powers this government's going to have are those enumerated in this document. And so we're going to tell them what they can and cannot do with the very document that's going to call the government into existence. Well, the American people said, well, okay, that makes sense. Maybe we'll take the chance. But as a condition of this, we want to make it real clear that there's no misconceptions here. We want a Bill of Rights to be enacted right after this government's called into existence. Well, it really shouldn't have been called a Bill of Rights because it doesn't give any rights at all. This sometimes shocks Americans. They think their rights come from the Constitution. Let me read you your constitutional rights. Even the Supreme Court gets this all off base when they say, well, let's see if you have a right to do this, well, let's look in the Constitution to see if it gives you this right. Well, the Constitution doesn't give rights. The Bill of Rights doesn't, read it real carefully. It doesn't give you any rights at all. It really should be called a Bill of Prohibitions. It prohibits the government from interfering with pre-existing rights. That your rights come before government. They're inherent. They're God-given. They're natural. They're inherent to your humanity. They pre-exist government. And so, if you read the Bill of Rights very carefully, you'll see it doesn't give rights. It prohibits Congress and the government from interfering, from infringing on freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press, the right to keep and bear arms. But 4 of the amendments, imagine 4, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th amendments deal with the power of government to come and grab you in the middle of the night, bash down your door, cart you away to a torture center, to a military camp, a dungeon, a concentration camp, torture you, rape you, execute you. That's the purpose of those amendments. That's what the American people said. This is not going to happen in this country. The 5th Amendment prohibits the government from taking any person into custody and carting them away in violation of due process of law. That's an unbelievable phrase. You know where that phrase comes from? Due process of law? It stretches back centuries, all the way back to the year 1215, to Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And you know what the significance of Magna Carta was? That it was the first time that the British people, who had suffered under this kind of omnipotent power where the king could just grab a person and cart him away to the Tower of London and torture him, or even worse, you've seen Braveheart, where the king's forces could take a woman on her wedding night and rape her. Magna Carta, they had King John, their very own king, their own government, at the point of a sword, and said, never again. Your powers are now limited, and acknowledge it to us. Openly acknowledge that your powers over us, the citizens, are limited. That you will never ever do this in violation of the law of the land. And that was the phrase in Magna Carta. You will not take our lives, you will not take our liberty, you will not take our property in violation of the law of the land. And that phrase, law of the land, gradually evolved into the phrase due process of law. And that's what's found in the 5th Amendment. That's what's found in the 14th Amendment. The idea of being protected from unreasonable searches and seizures without a judicially issued warrant. Because that's what the king was doing. King George was doing to the British citizens. Just general warrants, just barging into people's homes, and monitoring their activities and seeing what they were doing. Not in this country. No cruel and unusual punishments. No torture. And you see, I'm proud of that. What a fantastic system. When I was in law school, it was like, wow. When I started practicing law, it was like, this is awesome. What a wonderful system. That's a system. If I were producing a system in Guantanamo Bay, I'd say that's the kind of system it should be modeled after. But that's not what the U.S. military did. It's not what the Pentagon did. Instead, they produced a system that was exactly opposite to that. They said, we don't want to have anything to do with the principles in the Constitution. They said, we're free of the Constitution. We establish our own system. Okay, fine. But if you're going to take that position, why not, if you're going to produce a new system, model it after our system? Instead, they modeled it after Castro's system. They modeled it after Mubarak's system. They modeled it after the Chinese communist system. No due process of law. No presumption of innocence. They weren't even going to have criminal defense lawyers until the Supreme Court took jurisdiction and said, we do control what happens in this military outpost, and you will permit criminal defense lawyers. It was just the most incredible thing. Now, for a while, Americans thought, oh, it's just foreigners. No big deal. And yet, if you look at the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, our ancestors, they didn't limit those guarantees and protections to American citizens. Read it very carefully. It says all people were entitled to these protections, foreigners alike. And I was practicing law on the border down in Laredo, Texas when I first got out of law school. And Mexican citizens would be caught in Laredo and prosecuted in federal court. And it was just fantastic. It was just so awesome to see that foreigners were entitled to the same protections that American citizens were. I was proud of a system like this. And Americans thought, well, I don't need to worry about it because those are foreigners that are being treated like that. And we kept saying after 9/11, watch what they're saying. that the whole world's a battlefield, that anybody can be a terrorist, that the military's got control and the CIA's got control over who's a terrorist, that encompasses Americans. And sure enough, they took an American into custody, and they took him to a military dungeon, and they tortured him, and they kept him there indefinitely, and they said, we have the power to do this. And we defended him. You know, in terms of our articles, our columns. Why? Not only because we believed it was wrong what they were doing, not only because we opposed this competitive system that the Pentagon had established to prosecute terrorism cases. Terrorism cases belonged in federal court, we argued. But because we knew that if they won that one, it was going to extend to all Americans. They were effectively going to nullify the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. And sure enough, they did win in the federal courts. And sure enough, their principles applied across the board to Americans. And the ironic thing is that after several years of telling the federal courts that they had the power to do this to this man, his name was Jose Padilla, at the very last minute they switched him over into the federal court system, which is where we said that he belonged the whole time. And they prosecuted him as a federal court defendant. But in the meantime, they established the precedent that the military now controls in this country, in terms of terrorism cases. They have total control over the American people. Those guarantees in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments no longer apply in terms of terrorism cases. The military has control. That's an extraordinary thing. I mean, to put it in context, that's the power that the Mubarak, that the military dictatorship in Egypt wields to this day. Because despite the protesters' demand, that dictatorship still wields those powers. They won't relinquish them. They said the war on terrorism is too important. The war on drugs is too important. That's not what America's all about. That's not what a free society is all about. And I know, those of you that are in college, you've heard the same thing for the past 10 years. That you've been a teenager, getting into college and so forth. That this is a free society, that America's different. Thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free. Thank God the troops are over in Afghanistan and Iraq, because if they weren't over there, we wouldn't be able to have this assembly, and we wouldn't be able to have football games and baseball games, and thank God for the troops, because they're protecting our freedoms, which implies that we're free. And I believed it too. I grew up thinking it. I lived in a free country. And then one day all the scales fell off, and I said, this is just a big lie. It's just one great big lie. Because how can you have a free society when you've got the military and the CIA wielding principles that were contrary to the principles of freedom that were established by the Constitution? That when the government's wielding powers that are inherent to dictatorships. Now they said, well, this is necessary because of 9/11. It's an emergency, they said. We have to wield emergency powers. Oh yeah? Well, show me in the Constitution, in these enumerated powers, where it says that if there's an emergency, they have these powers. Where does it say that? Remember, this was supposed to be a document of enumerated, limited powers. Now, if there's a power there that says, okay, in the event of an emergency, you get to do these things, okay, that's one thing. Well, where is that? It doesn't exist. Because the framers knew, our ancestors knew, that emergencies are the perfect time for these people in government to assume these powers. And that's why they didn't provide an emergency exception for the wielding of these powers. Now you may say, oh, well, Jacob, they're not exercising them. You don't see mass roundups. But that's not the test of a free society. If the government wielded the power right now to put anybody in jail for criticizing the government, and they weren't wielding that power, they weren't exercising the power, but the power existed, would that not affect everybody's decision on how critical to be of government? Knowing that at any particular time in the right emergency, that all of a sudden they can take the sword out of the sheath and start exercising the power? The test of a free society is whether they even can wield the power. And that was the idea of prohibiting them with these amendments, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, so that the power could not even be wielded, much less exercised. And of course, we cannot ignore what went into 9/11. You know, they came and they said, oh, well, they hate us for our freedom and values. And isn't that what they told us? Because you see, the last thing they wanted you to examine, to question, to use your mind, to think, was that it was this very same system of military empire across the globe, 1,000 military bases in 130 countries, interventions, occupations, coups, like the one in Iran that destroyed Iran's experiment with democracy in 1953. The support of the dictator in Iran, the Shah of Iran, that precipitated ultimately the revolution there. The support of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. The support of the Mubarak dictatorship. The support of the dictatorship in Bahrain, where there's a big military base there. The unconditional support of the Israeli government. The stationing of troops on Islamic holy lands. The brutal sanctions in Iraq that were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. How can that not anger people? You know, even today, I mean, every time you see these terrorists, you know, the Fort Hood terrorists, the Detroit terrorists, anytime you see them asked, why are you doing this? Why are you so angry at this country? Why do you hate America? I mean, notice that you don't see Swiss diplomats getting killed. Why? I mean, why do they hate us and not the Swiss? And every time you ask these guys, why do you hate us? They always, inevitably, point to what the U.S. government's saying. The death and destruction this government has wreaked in the Middle East with this military empire. I mean, Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, 60 Minutes asked her when they had these brutal sanctions against Iraq, the same kind of sanctions they got against Iran right now. They asked her, it's been reported that 500,000 Iraqi children have died from the sanctions. Is this worth it? And of course, at this time, they were trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein and install a pro-U.S. ruler there, like they had done in Iran. And she said, well, yeah, that's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. What kind of mindset is that? Where you're willing to kill children for the sake of a political goal like regime change. How can this not anger people? And she may have been very well intentioned. She really may have meant it. I mean, I don't have any doubts that she meant it. That, yeah, it's a cost-benefit analysis. We sacrifice some children, but we get a pro-U.S. ruler. We get democracy. How can that not anger people? You see, this is what we have to do. We had a fascinating question last night. One of the students came up and asked, why do you guys do this? And they were asking the speakers, why do y'all do this? And the answer is because we put ourselves in the shoes of the victims of this U.S. foreign policy, of the Iraqi people that lost those families, that had their water and sewage facilities intentionally destroyed by the military and wouldn't let them repair them through 11 years of brutal sanctions. 2 high UN officials resigned during the 90s because of the sanctions. They called it genocide because those children were dying. We put ourselves in their shoes. We feel what's going on with the victims. Right now, the Iranian people, they're getting economically squeezed. They're losing their life savings because of these sanctions. It's a brutal policy. It's just wrong. That's what our answer was last night. It's just wrong. And so we take a stand against it. And that's why we're here. You know, we need help. Because what we're saying is that this country's on a wrong course. You can see it economically. We're headed toward bankruptcy. Everybody knows it. The government's spending $1 trillion more than what it's bringing in. And those of you that have worked summer jobs, you can look at your paycheck. You can see your withholding. You go in there and you think you're going to make $1,000 and you walk out with $600 because they've taken out $400. Wait till they start withholding 40%, 50%. Because let me tell you something, this ain't free. That national debt's increasing, and all these old people say is, oh, we're just passing it to the young people, no big deal. Well, it should be a big deal to you, and it's a big deal to us too. It's wrong. But it's morally wrong as well. And it's incumbent on us to change the direction. That's what true patriotism is all about. To change the direction of a country when it's in the wrong course. And this military empire is just wrong. John Quincy Adams, when he talked to Congress in 1824, I think it was the 4th of July. And he said, you know, America doesn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We don't have a big military empire. We're not going to go liberate people. We're not going to send military forces overseas. We're not going to democracy spread. We're not going to freedom spread. We're going to wish you well, but we're going to spend our time over here establishing a free society. And oh, by the way, if you're suffering dictatorship or famine or whatever, we're going to have open immigration here in this country. You get out of your country, come on over here. No questions asked. We may check you for tuberculosis or whatever, but this is the way we will help you. But we will not go and bomb you, and kill you, missile you, and so forth. I think they had the right vision. And that's the vision we're fighting for. To stop the invasions, occupations, empire, and so forth. And restore a free society. And our message to you is it doesn't matter whether you're a liberal, a conservative, a libertarian, non-ideological, where you're still trying to figure out your philosophy, it doesn't matter. That what you got to ask yourself is this right? This concept of empire and interventionism and coups and torture and so forth. And if you conclude that it isn't, join up with us. One of the grandest and glorious causes in the history of this country, in the history of the world, where we have our American spring. We lead the world out of this morass, where the rest of the world says, oh my gosh, it's the American people who are stirring. And we stop them dead in their tracks, and they look at us and say, wow. And we lead the world out of this. It takes principle, it takes commitment, it takes ideals, and we're looking for you to join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. Our next speaker is going to be representing the libertarian perspective on civil liberties, Mr. Glenn Greenwald. What is that? Oh, the liberal. I misspoke. Well, I don't know. We've been having a little bit of effect on Glenn during this trip, so we'll see how it turns out at the end. Glenn Greenwald, that was a slip-up. Glenn Greenwald is a columnist for The Guardian, a former constitutional and civil rights litigator, is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books on the Bush administration's executive power and foreign policy abuses. Greenwald was named by The Atlantic as one of the 25 most influential political commentators in the nation. He is the recipient of the first annual I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism and is the winner of the 2010 Online Journalism Association Award for his investigative work on the arrest and oppressive detention of Bradley Manning. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you one of the best defenders of the Constitution and best thinkers when it comes to the assaults on our civil liberties in the country today, Glenn Greenwald.
Thank you very much, and good evening, and thanks so much for coming out tonight, and thank you as well to the Young Americans for Liberty. As Jacob said, we've attended numerous events now sponsored by that organization, and they've all been excellently organized, which makes it a real pleasure to participate. I write a lot about, and I speak a lot about civil liberties, and when I speak a lot about civil liberties, I come to events like this around the country, and civil liberties is a pretty complex topic. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach speaking about it. There's a lot of different angles that you can examine. But regardless of what approach I take when I talk about this topic, the starting point for me always is to ask, what is it that we even mean when we use the term civil liberties? What is it that that phrase denotes? And the reason I think it's so important to begin that way is, well, in part, I just think the discussions in general are more productive if everyone has a common understanding of the critical terms that are being used. But more substantively, there's this strange paradox in American political discourse that the more important a term is, the more frequently it's invoked. Often it's the case that the more ill-defined it is. And there are all kinds of terms that are tossed around continuously in all sorts of important ways that really don't have any fixed meaning, or at least very little attention is devoted, even by those using the term, to what that term actually means, what the idea represents. And for me, the most vivid and significant example of that dynamic is the term terrorism, which probably is the most significant phrase in our political dialect when it comes to political and legal issues. And what's amazing about that term terrorism, is that it is virtually impossible to come up with a definition of what that term means that is at all consistent with how that term is applied. You can challenge yourself to do it, and it's virtually impossible. Ultimately, what this term really has come to mean is nothing more than he or she who meaningfully opposes the will of the United States. That's really the only definition that you can think about that at all explains how this term is used. And what's amazing is this term is of critical importance. It's the pretext for multiple wars. It justifies things like a torture regime and warrantless spying on American citizens. It engenders this vast secrecy regime behind which the United States government functions. It sends hundreds and hundreds of our fellow citizens to prison for decades based on accusations that they've materially supported it, and yet it virtually has no meaning. Very few people stop and think about what the term is, even as they use it over and over. And to me, this term civil liberties is somewhat similar in that regard. It's certainly not as pernicious, but the term civil liberties is something that all kinds of people invoke for all sorts of reasons. Everybody uses that term to justify whatever it is they believe in, oftentimes things that are inconsistent with one another. And yet it's almost ascended to this status of vapid cliche. It's not really a term that most people mean anything by when they use it. It's really just a slogan. It's not something that really ever gets debated. Nobody stands up in public, for example, and says, oh, well, on civil liberties, I just want you to know that my position is that I oppose them. It's not debated. It's just a phrase. But it actually is a lot more than a phrase if you stop and think about what it means. And so I just want to start by doing that. And there's a few good aspects to this endeavor to figure out what the term civil liberty means. One good part of it is that it's not actually a very complex concept. It's actually fairly clear and straightforward. All we mean when we say civil liberties, the only thing that we're describing when we use that term, is the list of prohibitions that we have imposed on the government in terms of what it is that they can do to us. It's the restrictions that as a citizenry we have told the government they are required to abide by if we're to recognize their power as legitimate and valid. It's the lines that we've told them they cannot cross when they interact with us. And the other good aspect about this list of prohibitions that we've imposed on what the government can do, is that it's not very difficult to find this list. You don't have to go on some kind of scavenger hunt in search of it. It's all contained in one place, in one document actually, called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which really is intended to be the one place that you go to see this list of prohibitions that we've imposed on the government. And the other good thing about this concept of civil liberties and this list of prohibitions that we've imposed on the government is that the prohibitions themselves are very clear and they're absolutist in nature. They're not muddled and ambiguous. They are not circumstantial or conditional. They are clear, they have great clarity to them, and they apply in all circumstances, not sometimes or most of the time. And you can just look at them to see that that's the case. So the First Amendment says that no law shall be enacted by Congress abridging freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And the Fourth Amendment says there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures of our papers, persons, or homes without search warrants issued upon a finding of probable cause. And the Fifth Amendment, as Jacob said, says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. These prohibitions are clear and they're absolute. I remember I had this fairly acrimonious exchange once with Joe Klein, who's the writer for Time magazine. And actually I've had many acrimonious exchanges with Joe Klein, but this one in particular that I'm thinking about occurred in, I think, 2007 or 2008. And we had a disagreement about some civil liberties issue. I don't recall exactly what it was. And this argument extended over the course of a week or even almost 2 weeks. And it was very intense and very contentious. And in the middle of it, one of the things that he wrote in response to something I had said near the beginning, he said something like, well, I think ultimately what's really driving all of this is the fact that you need to know that Glenn Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And I remember when I read that, I was genuinely baffled. I had reacted with a great deal of confusion when I had read that term. And the reason why I was so confused when he said that was because it was this very vituperative exchange. We were exchanging all these accusations and insults, and all of a sudden I couldn't figure out why it was that he just decided to stop in the middle and compliment me that way. Like, lavish all this great praise on me. Suddenly I thought he had a great change of heart. And then a couple minutes later I realized, no, actually when he uses the term civil liberties extremist, he actually thinks that that's a bad thing to be, like that's an insult. And the reason why I was so confused is because to me, civil liberties extremist is the best thing that somebody can call you. It's the thing that we should all aspire to be. And the reason that I say that, the reason that I think that is because if you look at what these civil liberties are, if you look at how they're expressed and how they were intended to apply, there is no such thing as defending them. There is no such thing as believing in them unless you are an extremist about it. And the reason for that is that the prohibitions that we imposed on the government in this Constitution, the agreement that we made with the government about how they can exercise their power, the way that these are expressed is not that these lines are lines the government can't cross unless they can prove that doing so is good for our safety or produces some beneficial or effect, or that these are lines they can't cross except in situations of war. These are prohibitions that are absolute. They can never be crossed, no matter the benefit, no matter the justification. And you see that in all sorts of ways. I mean, the core value embedded in the Constitution, the thing that we're always taught from childhood is what makes the United States free, is the distinctive hallmark of the country, is that these freedoms are freedoms that are supreme. They subordinate all other values. And this is a concept that has really been lost, so that if you stand up now and say something like these prohibitions should be honored in all circumstances, including war, even when it means that we're risking safety to do it, you get viewed as being radical and fringe and extremist. And yet this was always the animating principle of what made the United States the United States. And all you have to do is just think about what the Constitution does, the remarkable thing that it does, to see how true that is. So just look at the Fourth Amendment, which all of us are taught, which we all understand. One of the things the Fourth Amendment does is it says that the police cannot enter our homes unless they first go to a court and demonstrate to a court with evidence that there's probable cause to believe that we've done something criminal or wrong. And the reason that's so remarkable, that prohibition, is because what that means is that there are all kinds of situations where there will be a murderer on the loose, or a serial rapist, or a child molester, or somebody menacing a community, or a terrorist. And what this document decided was that they wanted to hamstring the police. It would be much easier for the police to catch violent, threatening criminals if they could simply invade our homes at any time, at will, and look through all of our things. But this document says, we don't want you to do that. We would rather have murderers and rapists and terrorists go loose, have you have a more difficult time apprehending them, because our privacy, our ability to keep you out of our homes and out of our papers, is more important to us than pure safety, than pursuit of pure safety. This is the value judgment that is made over and over in the document and in the history of the United States. And that's why civil liberties extremism is the only way to believe in that. And what's amazing is that if you look at the amendments that I just talked about, the rights and limitations that I just described, what you see in the United States is that they are being continuously violated. Not violated in isolation, but violated systematically. So if you look at the First Amendment, the right of free speech, what you see over the last decade is a whole slew of prosecutions aimed primarily at Muslim Americans, but not only, that have been based on things like expressing ideas or uploading YouTube videos that the government says, because they're critical of U.S. foreign policy, are designed to enhance and promote the goals of a terrorist organization. There are people sitting in prison for having done that based on that theory. If you look at the Fourth Amendment, the prohibition on searches and seizures without a search warrant, what you see is this gargantuan American surveillance state that collects all kinds of data and that stores it and that it monitors communications and eavesdrops on electronic communications and monitors activities, not of people about whom they've proven to a court there's probable cause to believe are guilty, but all citizens. And the most amazing statistic in that regard is there was a 2010 Washington Post series from 2 years ago called Top Secret America. You can go Google it. I'd recommend highly that you do it. It's one of the only times in the last several years that in a major American newspaper something of true worth was actually published. And it talks about how the national security state and the surveillance state of the United States is so sprawling and so secretive that even the people who run it don't have an idea what it does. But one of the statistics that was buried within the middle of it was a passage that described how every day in the United States, not every month, not every year, every day in the United States, the National Security Agency collects and stores 1.7 billion electronic communications by and among American citizens. Telephone calls, emails, chats, all kinds of electronic communications. Essentially, it's collecting and storing everything. In fact, it collects so much that the one saving grace is that it collects so much that they actually can't figure out what they even have. But if you compare that to what the Fourth Amendment says, which is that there shall be no searches of our persons, papers, or homes without search warrants, you see that the Fourth Amendment as well, like the first, has been rendered impotent and irrelevant. And then if you look at the Fifth Amendment, that there shall be no deprivation of life or liberty without due process, you see the U.S. government establishing a network of prisons around the world in which it puts people into cages, often for life, without due process of any kind. People are starting to die at Guantanamo now that after being there for a decade, despite having never been charged with any crime. You see the president now even claiming the power to target people for assassination, the ultimate deprivation of life without due process. And so you see these civil liberties being eroded in radical and fundamental ways, ongoing and continuous. And so I think there's a couple of questions worth asking that really get to the crux of the matter about that fact, about the fact that this has taken place. And the first question is to ask, why is it that we've allowed this to happen? Why does this continue to exist with very little backlash? And then the second question to ask is, what are the implications of allowing the government to continuously cross these lines that we've told it cannot cross in exchange for accepting their power as legitimate? So just let's go to that first question, which is, why does this happen? Why do we allow the government, and why have we allowed it with so little backlash relatively to erode these core liberties? And there's several reasons why I think that's happened. The first of which is the perception that the erosions of civil liberties affect only small, discrete minority groups, and therefore the majority need not be concerned by them because it won't affect them. And this is the history of what governments always do in every culture and in every era when they want to abuse government and political power, is they begin by targeting groups they think are extremely unsympathetic and that lack power, based on the expectation, usually the expectation that's fulfilled, that the rest of the society, most of it anyway, will not care that that group is being targeted because they won't perceive that they're being affected. And there's a couple of things that are worth saying to people who actually think that way about why that's so irrational and warped. One is just the grotesque immorality of deciding that you're only going to care about injustices when they directly affect you. But if somebody is already of that mindset, there's probably not a lot you can do about that in terms of making a moral appeal. So you want to think about the pragmatic argument about why that's so ill-advised to embrace that mindset. And the reason why that's such an ill-advised way of thinking, that as long as these civil liberty abuses are taking place only over there to those people, I don't have to worry about them, is that in history, it is always the case, not sometimes the case, not usually the case, always the case, that abuses of power extend far beyond their original application. And you can see that in the post-9/11 era so clearly in so many ways. If you look at how the Patriot Act, which was enacted based on the threat of terrorism by Muslims, has been used in the decades since its enactment, what you find is that in the overwhelming number of cases where it was applied, where its detention and surveillance powers were used by the government, those cases have zero to do with terrorism and have to do with all kinds of other completely unrelated federal laws. Or if you look at the primary tactic that the FBI now uses to stop terrorism, which is that the FBI thinks of a terrorist plot, it then finances it, it then goes out and tries to trick people into joining it, it then supervises its execution, and then at the last minute the FBI heroically jumps in and stops their own terrorist plot, and then announces to all of us that they've saved us from their own plot, which is what they've done just this week, this extremely manipulative tactic that puts all kinds of young and vulnerable people into prison who had no predisposition to commit a crime. What you find now is that that tactic too is extending far beyond Muslims where it was originally directed, and is now extended to things like anarchists or people protesting NATO policies in Chicago or the Occupy movement, all kinds of other forms of American dissent. And ultimately, what you can really see, where you can really see the trend is that if you look at what national security officials in the United States talk about when they talk about the terrorist threat, what they used to talk about, say, 8 years ago or 6 years ago, was that the greatest national security threat in the United States was Al-Qaeda, was foreign terrorists, first in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and now in Yemen. What they now talk about, though, is that the greatest national security threat is the threat of homegrown terrorism, terrorism that takes place in the United States. And therefore, all of the powers that they had been using outside of America, directed at foreign nationals, is now being gradually imported onto domestic soil. So you see the recent repressive measures, the erosions of civil liberty, things like the National Defense Authorization Act to allow indefinite detention on American soil, the dilution of Miranda rights for people accused of terrorism, proposed legislation to strip people of their citizenship in order to then deny them constitutional rights. All of these measures are now directed inward domestically in the United States, far beyond either foreign nationals who are Muslim or even American Muslims. That's the process by which civil liberties erosions extend beyond the original group. And the problem with taking the position that you're only going to care when it starts to affect you, but not when it affects these other groups, is that once the government is successful in eroding civil liberties for a particular group whom it originally targets, those abuses become institutionalized, they become legitimized, and there's no longer any way to resist their more generalized application. So if you permit the government to put people in prison without charges because they're Muslims and you think they deserve it or you don't care, or you allow the president to decide that he's going to target people for death, including fellow citizens, with execution without charging them with a crime because they have a sort of weird-sounding Muslim name and they're in Yemen, so they probably have done something wrong. You're not just authorizing and approving of the application of that power to those people. You're approving and authorizing the power of the government to imprison people without charges, period, or to kill people the president decides deserve to die, period. And once that power then starts to get applied to other people who you think may not deserve it, it becomes impossible to stop. And this is one main reason why these abuses have been permitted to continue, because of this perception that it only applies to others. The second reason that I think is very significant in terms of why these powers have been permitted to be seized without much backlash is the role that partisan allegiance plays in transforming these policies into bipartisan consensus. And there's all kinds of interesting ways to look at how that works. But there's one in particular that I would start with, which is a 2008 report that was prepared by the CIA. And it was a top secret report prepared in the height of the 2008 election. And this report, ultimately, though top secret, was leaked to WikiLeaks, which published it, and you can go online and read it. It's really fascinating, because what prompted the report was that the CIA was very worried at the spread of anti-war sentiment in Western Europe. There had been growing opposition to the war in Afghanistan in particular throughout Western Europe, and a couple of Western European governments had actually fallen because the population was angry at the ongoing involvement in the war in Afghanistan, and they elected anti-war governments who had pledged to withdraw the troops quickly, and then they did so. And the CIA was petrified that this would spread throughout Western Europe, would cause a withdrawal from Afghanistan, as well as the broader war in the Muslim world, and then would eventually spread to the United States. And what the report concluded was the best protection against this trend, was the best asset the American government had to combat it, was the election of Barack Obama. And the reason for that was because the election of Barack Obama would mean that the face of this war collectively, of American militarism in general, would no longer be this sort of swaggering, unilateralist, evangelical cowboy. It would be a much prettier and gentler and a progressive constitutional law face that was beloved throughout Western Europe. And that once that face became the symbol of these wars would be viewed as humanitarian and magnanimous, and public support for them would be revitalized and sustained. And it was incredibly prescient because that's exactly what happened with the election of Barack Obama, not only in terms of American militarism, but in terms of the erosion of of civil liberties as well. Huge numbers of people who had previously claimed or pretended to be opposed to these things suddenly began to embrace them because it was now an Obama policy rather than a Republican policy. And I saw that process very vividly myself, just in my own experiences. As I began by saying, I've been speaking about civil liberties for several years now in the United States, and if 4 years ago, say in 2007, 2008, I had stood up in a room full of, say, 100 randomly assembled Americans, just a room like this, and I denounced the policies that I'm denouncing tonight, what would unquestionably happen in a room like that is that 50% of the room, the people in that room, would be incredibly hostile to the things that I'm saying. They would be very antagonistic. They would think that I was saying all kinds of horrible things. Those people were called Republicans. And 50% of the room would be incredibly supportive. They would be boisterous in their cheers. They would say, I agree with you completely. These are horrible policies. We can't allow this radicalism to continue, the shredding of the Constitution. Those people were called Democrats. And yet, 4 years later, if you assembled that same exact crowd of people in the same exact room, and I stood up and gave the same exact speech and denounced the same exact policies, you would have 85% or 90% of the room hating me, maybe 80% if I'm lucky, and 10 or 15 or 20% being supportive because these policies have been transformed from what they were just a few years ago, which was the symbol of right-wing radicalism, an attack on the Constitution, all the things that it was called in democratic circles, into what it is today, which is bipartisan consensus. And that has transformed the citizenry from a divided citizenry over these policies into one that are so supportive of it by consensus that they barely talk about them any longer. A couple of days ago, because I was traveling, I ended up getting subjected right before the debate to the horror show known as MSNBC, and I was watching it because I had no choice, and this amazing thing took place on the television. At least it was amazing to me, maybe because I don't watch it very much, and my immunity system is low, or I don't have sufficiently low standards. But what happened was they had this crowd of people who had been assembled by MSNBC, and they were like waving all their big O sign, those big O's, and all the forward slogans or whatever they have. They were hardcore Obama supporters, and in other words, MSNBC viewers. And Chris Matthews was hosting the show before the debate, and he decided that, the way that media people sometimes decide that they're going to go like on a field trip and an excursion to go study real people. So he thought it would be interesting to go and talk to the real people who had been assembled and ask them, if they had the chance to question one of the candidates, what is it that they would ask? And the first person that he asked said, I would ask Mitt Romney why it is that he's waging this vicious war on women. And the whole crowd erupted in this, hysterical applause and cheering and all of that. And then he went to the second person and the next in line and said, what would you ask? And he said, that person said, I would ask Mitt Romney why he completely despises the middle class and wants to steal all of our money and give it to his rich friends. And they all waved their O signs and cheered and did all of that. That was super popular. And then they got to the third person, and it was this guy, and Chris Matthews said, what would you like to ask? And he said, well, actually, my question would actually be for President Obama. I would like to actually ask him about drones. And this really dark silence descended on the crowd. It was like they were all mortified, and Chris Matthews didn't quite know what to do. And so then he said, well, what is your position on that? And the guy looked at him like he couldn't even believe he was being asked, like there was only one thing in the world to say. And he said, I don't think we should be murdering innocent people with our weapons. And the crowd was either on the verge of like some sort of rage riot tearing him from limb to limb, or just some kind of like collective clinical depression. So Chris Matthews had to like really quickly go to the next person, who then, got back to why does Mitt Romney hate the middle class, and it was all fine again. But what was amazing was this is the same group of people who only 4 years ago were pretending to have, not as ancillary concerns, but central concerns, the restoration of civil liberties, the cessation of U.S. militarism and aggression and killing innocent people in the Muslim world, who just a few years later now could not care any less about those issues. In fact, are actively supportive of those policies because it's a Democratic president doing it. And to me, that's one of the most significant aspects both of the Obama legacy and the reason why civil liberty abuses have been permitted to take hold to such an extent. And I just want to highlight one aspect that I think really illustrates that point. if you look at what the primary controversies were during the Bush era, just a few years ago, that made progressives and Democrats and liberals run around screaming about the war on the Constitution and the shredding of the values and all that, it was things like George Bush's asserted power to be able to imprison people, including American citizens, without due process. Or his power, his claimed power to eavesdrop on our conversations without first going to court and having judicial review, going to court and getting a warrant. And this was the kind of thing that made Democrats insist that this was the most radical government we had ever had. And I was one of the people making those same statements back then. But here you have 3-4 years later, a president, a successor president, who does not merely assert the power to detain us without charges, although he does that, or merely assert the power to eavesdrop on our conversations without judicial review, though he does that too, but asserts the power to target us for assassination without due process of any kind. A power that he not only asserts in theory, but has exercised in fact, as he did when he assassinated the American Yemeni cleric in Yemen in late 2010, Anwar al-Awlaki, and then 2 weeks later killed his 16-year-old American son, Abdul Rahman, without a whiff of transparency or due process, or evidence presented of wrongdoing, or oversight or checks of any kind. And the same people who 3 or 4 years ago were so insistent that merely detaining and eavesdropping people without due process was an intolerable state of extremism now sit by quietly, if they're not actively cheering, when their president targets people for assassination without due process. That is the way in which these policies, once so divisive, so recently, have become shielded as bipartisan consensus, and that is a major reason why these erosions have been permitted to take place. The final reason that I just want to talk about and highlight briefly about why civil liberties erosions have taken place with so little backlash is to talk about the way in which extremism can become very quickly normalized. This is something I realized just a few months ago. I was actually going back and reading some political debates in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack in like October and November of 2001. And what was extraordinary about that time was that in the wake of the 9/11 attack, every sector of the American society virtually was incredibly acquiescent, really almost submissive to demands of the Bush administration. Whatever the Bush administration said it wanted, the media, the Congress, the citizenry were basically willing to give it in the name of this crisis, in the name of the trauma that the country had suffered. And yet, even in this extremely subservient climate, with no dissent virtually, when the Bush administration introduced the Patriot Act, it triggered some pretty substantial debate. There were a lot of people in mainstream circles standing up, even in the weeks of after 9/11, and warning that the Patriot Act was actually a very radical piece of legislation, that the powers of detention and surveillance it vested were a fundamental abandonment of everything that we had thought the United States was constructed to guarantee. You can see editorials in the New York Times and other places, all kinds of commentary on television in which people were warning about the Patriot Act and the dangers that it posed. And in fact, so widespread was this belief that when the Congress enacted the Patriot Act, and it was enacted by something like a vote of 99-1, Russ Feingold was the one person in the Senate who voted against it, there was a provision inserted into it that said that the powers we are vesting in the government shall expire in 4 years. And the reason for that was that the country knew that the powers that they were creating under the Patriot Act were radical and extreme. And the argument was made that although we need to vest these powers in the name of this emergency, we don't want this to become a permanent part of the American landscape, and so they'll expire in 4 years. And what happened 4 years later, even though there was not another successful terrorist attack on American soil, was that when it came time to decide whether the Patriot Act should be renewed, Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly, I think there were 10 votes against it in the Senate, voted to extend it without a single reform, even in the face of abundant evidence that had been systematically abused. And then 4 years later, in 2009, when it came time to renew it again, the Obama administration demanded its renewal. There was almost no debate in the U.S. Senate over it this time. Rand Paul stood up and said, I think we should have a couple of minor modifications to safeguard against its abuse. Harry Reid then stood up and ripped the page out of Karl Rove's book and said, Rand Paul is jeopardizing the United States and is going to cause a terrorist attack and have blood on his hands if he impedes for one more day the renewal of the Patriot Act. The Senate then voted something like 92-7 to renew it. What this shows is that the Patriot Act, once the symbol of extremism and radicalism, an extremely controversial piece of legislation only 8 years ago, today is not controversial at all. Nobody talks about the Patriot Act anymore. When it comes time to be renewed, nobody notices. It barely has any opposition. This is how extremism becomes normalized. People become accustomed to these things very quickly and then just accept and acquiesce that they are here to stay. So having talked about why I think this has happened, I just want to talk a little bit at the end here about what I think is the major implication of allowing the government to cross the very lines that our central document insisted they under no circumstances could ever cross. And some of these implications are obvious. If we allow the government to criminalize the expression of certain views, it means our ability to engage in political activism or criticism of the government is severely constricted. If we allow the government to eavesdrop on our conversations in mass and without restriction, it means our right to privacy is completely illusory. If we allow the government to target us for assassination or imprison us without due process, it means the government is omnipotent. But I think there's a very important, more difficult to get at, more evasive implication, but one that's probably the most important of all, that I just want to spend a little time talking about. And that is when you allow the government to transgress these limitations at will, you fundamentally alter the relationship between the citizenry and the government. And what I mean by that is that in a society that's free, by definition, to me, the defining hallmark of a free society is that the people who exercise political power fear the consequences of what will happen if they abuse that power. They fear the people over whom they exercise that power. But in a tyrannical society, by definition, the exact opposite is true. The people over whom power is exercised fear the government, fear the people who are in power, because they know that there are no lines that the government is unable or unwilling to cross. There is no constraint that can be imposed on what the government can do to them. And I think that's exactly the situation that we have in America, that once you allow government to cross and transgress lines, this climate of fear gets created, gets installed, that puts the citizenry in fear and changes the relationship that it has to the government in all sorts of fundamental ways. And I just want to share with you one personal anecdote that happened to me a couple of years ago when I really started realizing just how viscerally true this was. And it actually had a pretty significant impact on how I look at a lot of these issues. It took place in January of 2010, which was the very first time that I wrote about the organization WikiLeaks. I've written a lot about them over the last 2 years in defense of that group, but this is the first time I had ever written about them. And January 2010 was a time when almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks. It was before most of their most significant leaks, including me. I had never heard of WikiLeaks. And the way I learned about WikiLeaks was that in 2008, the Pentagon had prepared a top secret report. It was designated top secret. And they formally declared WikiLeaks in this report to be an enemy of the state. And they talked about how WikiLeaks proposes this profound threat to American national security, and it actually plotted ways to destroy the organization. And ironically enough, this top secret Pentagon report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its website. And everybody went and read it, and the New York Times wrote a short article about it, which is how I learned about it. And this article said, you know, there's this weird, strange, obscure transparency group called WikiLeaks who has this like bizarre, kind of obscure founder, this Australian citizen, and yet the Pentagon has decided they're an enemy of the state and should be destroyed. And I remember after I read that, I remember thinking, my first thought was, well, any group that the Pentagon is declaring to be an enemy of the state and is plotting to destroy is one that deserves a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. And so I went and I did a lot of research about WikiLeaks, and I had seen all these remarkable episodes where they brought transparency on a localized scale to corporate waste dumping in East Africa, to corruption in a southern state in Australia, to deceit on the part of city officials in Berlin after a fatal fire. And I really saw the promise of transparency that this organization was bringing, that the threat that it could pose to the regime of secrecy behind which the American national security state operates was, to me, very impressive. And so I wrote a long article about WikiLeaks, and I interviewed its founder, Julian Assange, and I published the audio of that interview online. And at the end of this article I wrote, I encouraged people, my readers, and as many people as I could, to go and donate money to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks because they knew they were sitting on some big secrets that they were having a hard time process because of budgetary constraints. And I encouraged people to wire money to them, and I put a link about how you could wire money to WikiLeaks' bank account or how you could donate money to the organization through their PayPal account and other ways of supporting them. And in response to that article that I wrote, and to that, in particular, to that passage where I encouraged people to support them, I had dozens and dozens and dozens of people, literally, dozens of American citizens, who said to me in all different venues, in the comment section to that article, in emails, in events like this, said along the lines of, look, I completely understand the argument that you're making about the promise of WikiLeaks, and I agree with you completely, and I want to support WikiLeaks. The problem is that I'm actually afraid that if I donate money to WikiLeaks electronically, by PayPal or wire or some other means, that I'll end up on a government list somewhere. Or even worse, that I could be subject to criminal liability as a result of materially supporting a terrorist group. And the reason that I found that so remarkable, the reason that had such a profound impact on me, was because these were American citizens. And these were not people prone to wild conspiracy theories and paranoia. Trust me, I can recognize people who are like that from extensive interaction. These are people who are very sober and rational people. And they were afraid. They had been intimidated and bullied as American citizens out of exercising their own core constitutional rights, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It is core free speech and free associational rights. They had decided that the government could transgress all kinds of lines and do all sorts of things to them, and they were afraid of exercising their own rights, despite the fact that WikiLeaks had never been, in fact still never has been and never could be, charged with any crime. And what was so remarkable to me about that was that that's what I realized at the time, was that you can offer all the rights that you want, in theory, on paper, on parchment, on a piece of parchment, to a citizenry. But if you sufficiently intimidate the citizenry, put them into a state of fear as a result of telling them that there are no lines that they are prevented from crossing, those rights become completely irrelevant. They become existent purely on a theoretical level. And I think this is really what the primary implication is of allowing governments to cross all sorts of lines. The government has found lots and lots of ways over the past 10 years to signal to us that there are no lines that it is unable or unwilling to cross when it comes to punishing people who they think have meaningfully opposed them. That was why the government abducted people from around the world and dressed them up in orange jumpsuits and shackles and put them on a prison in the middle of the ocean and showed the world what they had done. These are all ways of showing people that if you meaningfully oppose what we do, if you want to meaningfully oppose what our agenda is, look at all these things that we've done to people and think twice about whether that's something you want to do. And I think that's an extremely effective tactic that has really altered the way the citizenry thinks. And the most pernicious aspect of that is that when you put a citizenry into a state of fear of exercising their own rights, it's actually a much more effective mode of tyranny than sending jackbooted thugs in and overtly revoking those rights. Because when people voluntarily relinquish the exercise of their rights out of fear, they convince themselves that they're actually free. They tell themselves that there's nothing that they want to be doing that they're prevented from doing, and therefore they're free because they don't feel oppressed. They don't feel constrained because they've been intimidated out of challenging the government. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg put that best. She said, "He who does not move does not notice his change. He who does not move does not notice his change." So if you intimidate a citizenry into being passive and acquiescent because they fear what will happen from the government if they don't, not only have they lost their freedom, but most insidiously of all, they'll believe they're free, and it becomes impossible or very difficult to convince them otherwise. So ordinarily when I stand up in an event like this and talk about these things, I like to end by addressing the question of what can be done about all these things, because what ends up happening if you don't do that is there's this danger that you can just kind of spread this really dark and ugly like gloominess. You know, like, God, I just went to this event and I listened to these people talk about all these rights abridgments and how formidable the forces are behind them, and I think I want to just go in my house and shut all the doors and close the windows or jump off a bridge or something, and you know, that's the kind of reaction that you can breed. And it's and we're going to save time for the question and answer session where usually that question is addressed. So I'm not going to address that now, but the one thing that I will say is that it's very easy to look at any sector of history, including recent history, and draw a very clear conclusion. And that conclusion is that any structure that is built and created and sustained by human beings can be torn down and subverted and replaced by other human beings. There's all kinds of examples that prove how true that is, no matter how formidable those structures seem. And if it's not something that we're able to do at the moment, it's not because it's impossible, it's just because we haven't tapped into the right passion and found the right strategy for doing it. And that's really what I know is my motive when I do my work on these issues, what I know the Future of Freedom Foundation is about. The reason that we're doing this tour is to have that conversation with people, to try and spur that passion, to try and figure out the right strategy for subverting and battling against these erosions of liberty. So with that, I thank you very much for listening and look forward to talking more in the question and answer.
Okay, and now we get to the portion of the evening where you get to talk back to us. I think the best and most efficient way to do this is I'll call on you and you ask your question. I'll repeat the question for recording purposes, but please try to minimize your statements and make it more of a question than a speech, if you don't mind. Who would like to ask the question first? Yes, ma'am.
What exactly constitutes judicial review?
What?
I think that's what the trouble is.
Okay, what exactly constitutes judicial review?
And it's a good question, and the concept of judicial review is critical because if you have a constitution that prohibits the government from doing certain things, you then need to have a way to enforce those prohibitions. So if the president exercises power or the Congress enacts a law that violates those prohibitions, somebody in authority needs to be able to pronounce who does that. And what our system of government says is that the role of the courts is to pronounce when the Constitution has been violated and to declare that act illegitimate. And the reason why that's so important is because most of what the Constitution is concerned with are abridgments of rights by majorities. When the majority of citizenry wants to suppress a particular view that it dislikes or imprison people without charges that it thinks deserves it, and the federal courts are immunized, or in theory, from political pressures through life tenure, through the inability to remove them, and so they are the body that has been created to review the acts of the government, the Congress, and the executive.
So take a specific instance. An individual is accused of something. Does a judge have to put his or her name on a piece of paper before a person can be taken away?
Well, in order for a person to be taken away, the Constitution says that you have to be charged with a crime, indicted by a grand jury, and then convicted beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury of your peers. So in order to be sentenced to prison, you first need to be found guilty of a crime by a court of law, and specifically by a jury. That's the role of the jury, and the court oversees that to ensure that it's taking place within the parameters of the law.
I'm talking about arrest. We have a person running for sheriff, running this gentleman here. Does a judge have to sign this paper? Supposing I'm accused of terrorism or a crazy video. Does a sheriff's deputy have first to get a judge's signature on a piece of paper before he comes to my home and take me away?
That really all depends, but in general, the answer is no. If, for example, there are circumstances where you're in the process of committing a crime, where you're posing a danger, the police have the authority without judicial review to arrest you. Judicial review comes after. There are times when the police need to secure arrest warrants when under other situations. So it's impossible to answer yes or no, but the police have the authority to arrest you, not to imprison you. Only a court can imprison you.
We're going to have to jump around letting people have questions. We might get to you here in a little bit. Who had a question next? Nobody else had a question right here?
Thank you both for coming. As both very good speakers, all three. I'm at 70 people a day, Monday through Friday, are processed here in Tucson at the federal courthouse in something called Operation Streamline. And they are quote-unquote illegal immigrants or whatever, and they're afforded some amount of rights, but essentially the judge asks them to give up those rights, and then they are taken away to prison and then deportation. I'm wondering if you can talk about this evolution of the terror security thing that we've been talking about within the scope of the drug war, being Iraq as far away that Mexico's pretty close.
Okay, questions about civil liberties as it relates to illegal immigration and that act?
Yeah, we need to distinguish between civil processes and criminal processes. And in the immigration field, those deportation proceedings are civil processes. They're not criminal in nature. So if they apprehend somebody that's here illegally, they can prosecute criminally. And they secure a grand jury indictment, or if it's a misdemeanor, illegal entry or whatever, they prosecute him. But the concept of due process basically involves notice and hearing. That before we can do something bad to you, we need to give you notice of the charges, and we need to give you the opportunity to be heard, to defend yourself. We will prosecute you with evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in which we satisfy the trier. But in a civil proceeding, which deportation is, there's a basic due process requirement, notice and hearing, but there's not a criminal prosecution because there's not liberty involved here. It's simply a deportation. We are returning you to your country of origin. So the process is a little bit different. The drug war is entirely different. It's a criminal offense here, all of a sudden we're talking about, and that stirs up what the lady here was bringing about. We are now going to take away your liberty because you're ingesting a substance that we don't approve of. Doesn't happen to be alcohol or tobacco, happens to be cocaine or marijuana or some illicit drug. And we have to go through a grand jury indictment. They may arrest with an arrest warrant. They might not. If they catch you on the highway and find some drugs there, they don't need to get a warrant of arrest, but they can take you in, but they have to bring you before a judge within a reasonable time, 2 or 3 days. That judge decides whether there is sufficient evidence to hold you. That's compared to a system where they just cart you away and they don't have to take you before a judge at all. They just take you to a military dungeon. They hold you there forever. They don't have to answer to a judge. And your question is very pertinent because I mentioned Egypt. In Egypt, their war on drugs is exactly like their war on terrorism. And now we see it in this country where the war on drugs is being integrated with the war on terrorism. You've got the military enforcing these things. You see references to how the drugs are funding the terrorists. They would like nothing more than to apply their principles in the war on terrorism to the war on drugs, where all of a sudden there's no more grand jury indictments. Or if there are, they're at their option, like in terrorism cases. So if they can either bring you into the federal court system or they can take you into the military system, where they just haul you away as a drug offender, no due process, no grand jury indictment. We just hold you, we torture you, we never have to release you. That's the difference.
All right, let's go back and forth. This gentleman right here. We're real fans of the TSA on this tour so far. It's been really nice.
The public, I guess, in general, doesn't really think of the TSA in a good light, but I think people still think the TSA is like a necessary evil, despite great evidence against that argument. How do you guys think the TSA, since the establishment of the TSA, play into the idea of governmental powers being influential that the police administration is being
Okay, that's a good question directed at Glenn. Is the TSA becoming normalized in ways that wouldn't have been accepted when it was established?
I mean, it's an interesting case because there was, I mean, bizarrely, one of the very few civil liberties controversies over the past 3 years was when the TSA introduced these backscatter machines and the pat-downs, and for a couple of weeks, civil liberties was probably one of the most talked about issues in the country, in part because it wasn't being directed only at a small group, and the perception wasn't that it was only being, that only a small number of people were being affected, but that everybody, and that was the argument was, well, we're fine with this if you're just doing this to Muslims, go ahead and keep doing that, but don't do it to my mother. And, you know, in part I was a little bit bothered because the impetus behind that controversy was kind of ignoble. I mean, there were way more serious civil liberties infringements than that machine that the same people angrily objecting to it are fine with. But ultimately what I realized is that, no, actually it's a good thing when people start to feel affected by these abuses, because regardless of what motivates it, the more controversies, the more anger over the way in which the government is intruding, the better. I mean, you could go back and look at, you know, first principles and even ask why the federal government has a role to play in creating these kind of security measures at the airport, and make a good argument that they lack the authority to completely. But even, you know, sort of just pragmatically, why do we go through this extremely elaborate and expensive security process to get on an airplane, but go through nothing to go into a crowded shopping mall or to get on a train or anything else? You see what really is going on here, which is the appearance of security combined with the massive amounts of money that are being made through these technologies. The way in which former national security officials start to lobby, start to advise, start even to own the companies that then sell these technologies to the government. That is a huge part of so much of what we're talking about. It isn't just consolidating the power, although that is a big motivating factor. It's also the fact that the sprawling national security state is incredibly lucrative for this combination of government and this sort of government corporate access. And so it becomes very difficult to dislodge. But you're right. I mean, it's a good case in the sense that it's one of the ways that you can actually get people to care because it affects them. And if you just spend 2 minutes thinking about it, the insanity of it becomes very manifest. And I often think it's a good gateway, to use a term from a different context, to get people to think about civil liberties in a way that's actually fruitful.
You're right. TSA is something that wasn't mentioned until now. I would also say that something like internet freedom, which is a fairly new civil liberties issue, that just shows how bad things are getting. We can't get to it all even in an hour and a half, 2 hour period. But let me go to another question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, another question for Glenn. You talked a little bit about the in Yemen, the killing of Anwar al-Awlaqi's son. And I think, and I can see why. For a lot of people, you see that, well, who really cares? Man, it's an Arab, Muslim, and it happened a million miles away. But can you see how it's hard to imagine an American citizen here in Tucson being killed by a drone attack? But can you see how that could evolve, or some variation of that could be applied domestically? An American citizen being killed without a drone.
Could what happened to Anwar al-Awlaki, the extrajudicial killing, happen domestically in the near future?
Right. I mean, that is a perfect case of what I was talking about earlier about how the government always targets the most unsympathetic people, because al-Awlaki really was a preacher who, the reason why the United States became interested in him was because he was a preacher who, he was actually, amazingly, around 9/11, he was considered one of the moderate Muslim preachers in the United States. He was actually invited to the Pentagon in the wake of 9/11 to meet with Bush officials. He actually had a column in the Washington Post in 2000, 2001, 2002 to talk about Ramadan and other Muslim holidays and sort of translate Islam for the Washington Post readers. And he became intensely radicalized over the next 6-7 years as he watched huge numbers of innocent Muslim men, women, and children being slaughtered by the U.S. government, and became a preacher who really was attracting the attention of the United States primarily because of the efficacy of his sermons. Because he was an American citizen born in the United States, he spoke English, he was reaching huge numbers of English-speaking Muslim youth around the world, and his message was, the United States is continuously attacking our countries, interfering, occupying, and killing us. We not only have the right, but actually the duty to target Americans with violence as a means of deterring future aggression. And it was really because of the expression of those ideas, which the Supreme Court has said is a First Amendment right. You can advocate violence under the First Amendment, that's the Brandenburg case, that the Obama administration decided they needed to kill him because he was just becoming too effective of a propagandist as they saw it. And so they targeted him for execution, and they went and killed him and then killed his son. And the reason that they did that was because he was unsympathetic to people. They kept showing the sermons where he said these things. He wore Islamic clothing because he had become a preacher and a imam, and he was fairly radical both in his religious and political views. And so people said, well, I'm willing to let the government kill him. He probably deserves it. He's urging death to Americans. But again, that's a perfect example where then you not only justify having people killed based on the expression of ideas the government dislikes, but there is no principled way to say that it is okay for the U.S. government to execute by drone people, American citizens who happen to be in Yemen, to distinguish that from saying it is okay for the U.S. government to target American citizens who are in India or Germany or on American soil, because the theory behind it is that there is no finite battlefield, that the whole world is a battlefield, and that therefore the president as commander-in-chief has the authority to kill whoever he declares to be an enemy combatant or an enemy, and that it wouldn't matter if the enemy, quote-unquote, is in Yemen or in Berlin or in Arizona. The theory would justify it all the same. There is no principled way to distinguish it and to confine it to those places. When you take that fact and combine it with the fact that drones are an inevitability, they are coming to the United States. There are already 575 or 580 already licensed by the FAA, many of which are already in use. They are surveillance drones, not weaponized drones, but it is inevitable that they will be weaponized as well. We will have drones over American cities en masse in a very short period of time. That is not conspiracy. Everybody who writes in this area recognizes that. And if you are endorsing the idea that drones can just kill whomever the president wants because he's an enemy, it is also inevitable that this will take place in the United States, because there is no principled way to object once you've endorsed that theory. And that's why, to me, the theory of President Obama that he can target American citizens for assassination and the exercise of that power, something that President Bush never did, that no prior American president had ever done. I don't mean that no prior American president had ever killed an American citizen before. They have, that they have expressly adopted the theory that they have the power to target them for execution by the CIA, is the most harmful and dangerous thing that the Obama administration has done, probably the most harmful thing in the realm of civil liberties over the last decade, including anything Bush and Cheney have ever done. And you can make the argument, and actually a writer at The Atlantic recently did make the argument, that it's such an extremist step that President Obama has done that even if you agree with him on every other issue, social issues, economic policy, other foreign policy issues, that line is such a profound line that anyone who crosses it doesn't merit support. And so I think your question is a critical one. It's one that I think about all the time, that I write about all the time, which is that power that he exercised in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki is one that not only can come to the United States, but almost certainly will. And once that happens, I mean, the implications are pretty easy to see.
Indication of just how bad it's gotten with domestic drones. Charles Krauthammer, of all people, recently expressed on Fox News that Obama was going too far. So that's pretty scary. Let me go to this gentleman in the back here.
Yes, this would be for either of the guests. Given the pretty concrete language of the Bill of Rights and the fact that this is no exception, I'm curious about when and where this began to slip, and what the justification is given for May the 1st and the second exception to what was explicitly stated.
When did we begin to slip and lose the Bill of Rights?
That's a fascinating question. I think it started to slip primarily in the area of the war on drugs during the 50s and the 60s, when conservatives especially started denigrating the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, when they started referring to these things as constitutional technicalities. They were designed to let guilty people go free, and that was their effect. Because once people started losing respect for those amendments and started to think in terms of, oh, we're just seeing all these guilty people go free, especially like in the war on drugs, then all of a sudden they lose the concept of the protection. This is a protection for all of us, especially the innocent. We don't want government to be doing these things, like Glenn said, because of it protects everybody in society. So it's the old legal adage, we're willing to let 10 guilty people go free in order to prevent an innocent person to be found guilty, because the thought that an innocent person is going to be executed with a death penalty or spend 30 years in jail for doing nothing is so horrifying that we're willing to take that chance. And that was the mindset of the Founding Fathers. And so, in my opinion, as the denigration of these civil liberties started going down, especially in the 60s and then in the 70s with the war on drugs, it became so easy that when 9/11 comes along and says, oh, well, now we've got this terrorist emergency, let's just nullify these things, let's just ignore them and let the military take over and exclude these concepts of due process of law, protection. And notice that in this terrorism field, they have an option. We hear this often that terrorism is an act of war. Well, it isn't. It's in the U.S. Code. I mean, you can just Google it. I mean, it's in the U.S. Code. It's a criminal offense. You can go into any federal court in the land. There's people being prosecuted for criminal offenses of terrorism. So it's a criminal offense. What they've done with it is say, we now have the option to send a person into the criminal field, the constitutional field with federal courts, or the military field where all these rights are denigrated or violated. Horribly pernicious doctrine where they say we can choose whichever way we want to go. And that's just not what this country is all about. You either have one way or another way. And the way that we're fighting for is, of course, the constitutional way.
Let me just answer. Oh, I was just going to
follow up on that.
I was just going to answer that too. If you want to do that now.
I just want to clarify. I was kind of curious about the judicial branch, who is supposed to be where the buck stops on this. At some point, some judge said, "Oh, there can be an exception to this liberty." Right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jacob said, but I would answer that question a little bit differently, both in terms of your original one and the follow-up that you just said, which is, the reality is that the violations of these principles began on the first day that they were enacted, right? I mean, the country was constructed as one big, huge violation of the very principles on which it was founded. And you can look very early on at, what the founders did. And I think it's important that when we talk about the brilliant ideas of the founders, that the ones that are enshrined in the Constitution, that we not romanticize them or pretend that they were something that they weren't. Not just slavery and those other injustices at the beginning of the Republic, but even things like the Alien and Sedition Act very early on that went to criminalize the expression of any ideas that the government thought were threatening to its foreign policy or its other national interests. And you can find all kinds of heinous Supreme Court cases that are incredible departures of what we think of now as the core liberties, including the Supreme Court Dred Scott case where, they're essentially legalizing the punishment of fugitive slaves, and all throughout. So there were all kinds of notions early on, just based on human temptation, that we should suspend these rights in the name of some expedient goal. The reason that the rights were expressed in this absolute way is precisely because the idea that we should let the government do certain things that the Constitution says they can't do in the name of some goal, it's a very strong human tendency. There's a strong human quest for personal and physical safety. So it's always the case, even among the most noble people, including every single person in this room who's singing the praises of the Constitution, that there will be a temptation to say, I actually think the government should be able to do this because I want it to be able to protect me from this danger. That's precisely why these principles are so critical. But this, to me, is the important point, is that even during those first couple of centuries, when you see extreme violations of these principles, often by the very same people who enacted them, what you find is that the principles themselves were very vigorously affirmed. So if you look at the debates around all of those injustices early on and then throughout the 19th century, what you'll see is that the way in which progress was made, and I think the history of the United States is one of incremental progress in lots of ways, what you find is that it's precisely the embrace, the vigorous defense of these principles that were the animating force behind that progress. So the reason why slavery ended up ending and emancipation happened or women received the franchise or all of those other injustices ended is because the principles in the Constitution were appealed to. The reason why communists were emancipated from the restrictions that they were put on them or other people who were deemed subversive is because of the values of free speech that the Supreme Court incrementally realized. It's the aggressive defense of these principles that is what is so crucial, not ensuring that they're never violated, because we're never going to have a situation where they're never violated. That, to me, is what has changed in the last 30 to 40 years, and I think the drug war is a great place to start. You could probably start in other places, is that it's the defense of these principles that has really weakened. You can actually find people in public with great respectability saying that these principles no longer matter. Throughout the last decade, you had all these senators in the Republican Party defending George Bush and Dick Cheney, these politicians who pride themselves on parading around as like tough guys and like rugged individualists and super patriots, explicitly mocking the idea of the Constitution and civil liberties. You had John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, and Jeff Sessions of Alabama, both saying essentially the same thing, which is, well, civil liberties really don't matter much if we're all dead. Kind of the exact opposite of the ethos of the country as embodied by Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, that actually it does matter a lot. And so I think it's what the change is not that we now suddenly violate these principles whereas we never used to. I think we always have. I think the change is that we no longer expressly prioritize them in terms of how we conceive of them. We've been trained to decide that they're actually low on the priority list and lots of other values can subordinate them and justify their violation. And that to me is the biggest change.
Let me add to that, endorsing everything he said, is that what the federal courts have done in the war on terrorism, I talked about Chile. When Pinochet took over, the federal courts in Chile just bent over backwards, and they just deferred to the military. So when the military was rounding up people and torturing them and raping them and killing them, including those 2 Americans, the courts just said, national security, we can't get involved here. Well, that's exactly what's happened with the federal courts. There's been some notable exceptions. There's a federal judge right now in New York who is courageously, a woman, courageously stood up and declared the NDAA unconstitutional, issued an injunction against it. Unfortunately, the Court of Appeals has issued a stay and is now going to hear the case. But by and large, the federal courts have just bent over backwards. All the military, the Justice Department, the CIA has to do is walk in and say the magic words, national security or state secrets, and the federal judges have abrogated their duty. Their duty is to stand up for that Constitution and to protect our rights. And in this era of the national security state, they have abrogated that responsibility.
Okay, we got time for a few more questions. This gentleman here has been eager the whole time, so go ahead.
Thanks a lot. First off, I'd just like to say welcome to the Constitution Free Zone of the U.S. Mexico borderlands. But I guess this is mostly directed to Glenn, but if Jacob has something to say, I'd love to hear it as well. I can't remember his name right now, but the editor of the Black Agenda Report has kind of upended this whole lesser of evils. Glenn Ford. Yeah, Glenn Ford. Great guy. Has upended this dichotomy, the lesser of two evils, nonsense that comes up every 4 years. And instead started calling Obama the more effective of two evils. And sort of building on a lot of what you were saying in terms of what he's been able to carry forward in terms of security policy, I guess I'd like to hear your response to that, and then certainly if Jacob has something to say, I'd love to hear that as well.
The gentleman wants to know if Glenn or Jacob are voting for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. Not exactly, but the lesser of two evils is the question.
Yeah, so I just want you to know ahead of time, there's no question that I'm more adept at evading than this one, because I get asked it every time, and I generally, I don't want to attach myself to a particular politician or go around sort of decreeing how people should vote or anything like that, because I think it's a little bit pompous. But I do want to, I will address the question this way, which is, I don't write very much about the election at all or talk very much about the election at all for a pretty simple reason, which is that I don't actually care very much about the election at all, and I don't find it very interesting. in part because all of the issues that we're talking about tonight are very unlikely to be affected remotely by the outcome. And to know that that's true, you can just look at what happened in 2008, where Barack Obama pretended to put as a centerpiece of his campaign the restoration of all of these principles, the reversal of so many of these abuses, and he did none of that. And now you see even less discussion of it because the parties are essentially in full-scale agreement, as Jack began by speaking about. Whether, you know, I think to me the issue of voting for one of the two parties or voting at all depends on a couple of things. One thing I think it depends on to a great extent is whether you're living in a state where the outcome is in doubt, where I think the considerations are much more difficult if you are living in a state where the outcome is in doubt, which I guess this state could be characterized that way. Not great doubt, but some doubt. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a political pundit, and I don't want to be. So if I'm wrong, I'm happy and don't care. But I mean, from what I understand, it's at least close. So you might have a different calculation than if you live in a state where the outcome is certain. But the much more interesting question to me is, you know, the argument in favor of voting for one of the two parties is that if you think that there's this one is the lesser of evil, the lesser evil, or that the differences are small but still there, even small differences in a apparatus as enormous as the federal government can translate into very significant differences in people's lives. And it's hard to just write those off in some theoretical way and say, well, I don't really care if people have or don't have health care, or if they have or don't have these benefits, because abstractly I just think lesser of two evils is intellectually offensive. You could make the argument that you ought to care even about those small differences because they translate into big impact. But to me, the more compelling way of looking at that is that probably the central problem that we have in our political process is that the most significant issues have no redress by going and voting for one of the two political parties. That the process that was supposed to be guaranteed as the means of political change, which is voting, is essentially largely inconsequential. I don't mean entirely inconsequential, but largely inconsequential. And so then the question becomes, how do you start to change that problem? How do you fix that problem? And if you're somebody who's just going to constantly devote yourself to voting for one of the two political parties on the grounds that short-term consideration is all that you care about, meaning I just want to have the less bad thing happen in the next election than the more bad thing happen, then what you're essentially doing is forfeiting the ability to change that problem by continuously propping up and devoting yourself in servitude to the two-party system. And only by working outside of it, only by refusing to participate in it, only by refusing to legitimize it, can more midterm and longer term solutions be attained. And that to me is the decision that everybody has to weigh for themselves, is how do you weigh the short-term implications versus the real urgent need on a slightly longer term, with a slightly longer term perspective, to subvert the two-party system. And that's why to me the much more interesting political activism is what's taking place outside of the two-party system, whether it be the kind of original impetus of the Tea Party before it got annexed by the Republican Party, the good version of the Tea Party, or the Occupy movement, both of which I think have a lot more in common with one another than is typically realized. Ways of imposing that kind of fear in the hearts of people who wield power, that real social disruption and disorder are possible if power and corruption continues to be abused. That's much more my focus than any of these voting issues. Did you see how good I am at avoiding the
Yeah, I agree with him that to vote for the lesser of two evils is still voting for evil. And I think that we need to look at this in terms of a systemic problem. For example, if we had a system and had a system for many years, let's say a couple of centuries, of government churching, where the government ran the churches and forced people to send their kids to church and so forth, and everybody was required to go to church, and there were government ministers, and all the corruption and so forth. Some people might devote themselves to, hey, let's get better candidates in office to run the government churches better, and hey, this guy's got a better plan to end corruption over in this church and so forth. I would sit here and say, why waste your time? Why not raise our vision to a higher level, to a separation of church and state, to getting government out of the business of religion, And that's the challenge that I'm throwing out to y'all here, is that you can spend your life trying to reform the military and trying to get out of Afghanistan and so forth, but there's a higher vision, and that is restoring a constitutional republic to our land, dismantling the whole military empire, bringing all the troops home from everywhere, discharging them, get rid of the standing military, or what Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex, restoring civil liberties, getting rid of the whole drug war instead of trying to get better drug war administrators in. I think that's the more glorious cause to get involved in, rather than trying to figure out which candidate's going to be better managing the torture and the concentration camps and so forth.
From a pure issues standpoint, I have a conservative columnist friend who writes for the American Spectator, and his two big issues in this election are he wanted to get rid of Obamacare and not go to war with Iran. And so he's like, okay, with Obama, we're definitely not getting rid of Obamacare, but still might go to war with Iran, but with Romney, probably more of a chance going to war with Iran, probably still won't get rid of Obamacare. So what kind of choice is that? Let's take two more questions. We're running towards the end. The lady back there in the back.
She basically said that she would 100% support that policy. Take out the fact that being American citizens voting, so say that they're definitely not American citizens, they're definitely a proven terrorist, taking American lives or other lives, would you support a policy with a very clean-cut drone strike?
If collateral damage weren't even a consideration in the drone strike activity, would you think it might be worthwhile?
Yeah, first of all, the fact that the liberal goes around advocating murdering people without any due process of any kind because of her intuition or feeling or whatever that the person is a bad person is a pretty good indication of exactly what I was talking about in terms of the Obama legacy and the way in which these policies have been transformed. But, no, I actually don't think... And I mean, it actually is amazing to me that it's even a question, and I know you're asking it in that vein, but that we even debate whether or not the president should have the ability to simply go around deciding that certain people have either done something wrong or are bad people and just decide that their life should be extinguished without any obligation to present that person with the opportunity to contest the accusations against them, to demonstrate to anybody that there's actually any validity of any kind to those accusations. I mean, obviously in an actual war, we've always accepted the fact that when there's an active battlefield, soldiers kill opposing armies without first serving them with papers. That's the nature of war. But it's precisely for that reason that war is the ultimate state of lawlessness, that the Constitution and the founders were so clear about the fact that it should be extremely hard to start them because rulers want to start wars because that's when their power becomes unleashed and is unlimited. And so we don't actually have a war in Yemen or in Pakistan or in Somalia or in Libya or in any of the other places where this is being done. So you could make an argument that there's one in Afghanistan, but even there's been no declaration of war. And so what it really is just extrajudicial assassination. It's just the declaration of guilt where the president acts literally as judge, jury, and executioner. And it's just completely beyond me how any person who identifies as an American citizen, let alone a liberal, can walk around advocating that the president has that power. If you think the president has the power to go around just killing anyone in the world who he wants, in total secrecy, with no obligation to demonstrate any evidence, with no oversight or checks, then it's essentially impossible to identify any limitations that you think the president should have. But this view has become incredibly common. In fact, there are polls that show that overwhelmingly American progressives and American conservatives as well are completely in favor of the drone program, even with all the quote-unquote collateral damage, the slaughtering of innocent people. So if you remove that, it is absolutely the case that Americans would largely endorse that, which is an extraordinary fact, that we would be willing to vest the that power in the president, that we trust the president so much to make those choices that we're literally willing to let him be the judge of life and death without any safeguards or oversight.
Okay, this gentleman's been very enthusiastic over here, and this will be the final question of the evening.
So, the concept of legitimacy was talked about, and we also kind of talked about the government's wonderful ability to propagate the usurpation of liberties through crises. And so my question is, how do you treat the inextricable link between the redistribution of resources from any sector, whatever, to the government, in the modality of taxation or whatever, serfdom or whatever? How do you treat that? I guess we could talk about taxation since we're in America. How do you treat that in relation to the usurpation of civil liberties? And do you think taxation writ large is representative of a usurpation of liberty?
Are they taking too much of our money and too much of our liberty?
Yeah, you raise a fascinating question. I think that, it certainly rises within the context of libertarian circles, especially late night debates. Is taxation legitimate in and of itself? And then if somebody believes it is are there any limitations to it? I mean, I think it was Justice Marshall said the power to tax involves the power to destroy. I mean, if the government has the power to take a person's income to whatever extent, then that's the essence of slavery. And in fact, that's where your generation is going in terms of the national debt and so forth. I mean, they say, well, don't worry about it. There's always going to be money there for Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. Well, sure, if your generation is willing to be taxed 80, 90% of your income, there's no limit, maybe 100%. Well, then how is that any different from slavery? And we see that with the military as well. I mean, the military spending continues to soar, and just keep taxing people. What's the problem? So they pay 40% of their income, 50% of their income. Oh, national security is at stake. Well, as a libertarian, I would say none of this is legitimate. That you don't need a vast military establishment. This notion that the terrorists are coming to take us away and take over our country is ridiculous. For one thing, as I indicated earlier, it's all rooted, the hatred, the anger, the rage is rooted in what the national security state is doing to people. If you get rid of that, then the threat evaporates. I've often argued ever since 9/11, this is the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history. The more people they kill, they've got 10 more family members that are mad. And so it's become self-perpetuating. You dismantle this stuff, then all of a sudden the burden of taxation and inflation and debt drops by about 50%. Now, where we might disagree, the liberal and the conservative, would be on the economic sphere. I mean, most of you know libertarians oppose the welfare state, the Social Security, the Medicare, the Medicaid. We leave all this in the hands of the free market, voluntary charity. Well, there's another almost 50% of the taxation burden. And so you eliminate the income tax, something that Americans live without for 130 years. I mean, to us as libertarians, we say that's what freedom's all about, keeping everything you earn, deciding what you're going to do with it, charity, investment, retirement, honor your mother and father on a voluntary basis. And then all of a sudden you decide, okay, well, do you need taxation for the legitimate functions of government? And I would argue no. But there have been libertarians, I would say make it all voluntary. But there are libertarians that would argue, yeah, there's nothing wrong with taxation for the legitimate functions of government. Okay, we can have that debate later on. But I think where we can all agree on is this vast military establishment. And that's where Glenn and I think, agree on, and Bruce Fine would agree on it. This is where the money is wasted, and there's no legitimate purpose for it. That's where I would come out.
Well, I guess if Levin's going to treat this question, my question would be, how do you differentiate between this sort of transcendent right to free speech, or all the inherent rights we have in the Bill of Rights, from the right to property and the ability to keep my wages, from whether it's a tyrannical Leviathan government or any government, whatever, is that a usurpation of civil liberty? Right.
So here's what I would say about that. Traditionally, one of the prime divergent grounds for libertarianism and liberalism the reason why they're different ideologies is because of this fundamental disagreement on questions of economic policy and of the type of question that you just asked. So, you know, a libertarian would say what Jacob just said, traditionally, whereas a liberal would take the argument that joining a society and taking part in its benefits, using its roads, using its being protected by its defense, all those things that are collective, whatever you think are legitimate functions, requires responsibilities in return, which means that you voluntarily agree to pay for them and you can remove yourself from the society if you don't. So put that debate to the side for the minute, because I think that this divergence is actually a lot less significant now than it used to be. And the reason that I think that is that even on economic policy, you know, libertarians and liberals can always agree on the drug war, civil liberties, foreign policy. There's lots of grounds for agreement. But even on economic policy, where there's a perception that there's a great disagreement, I think that there's become much less of a disagreement. And that's because the disagreement would exist if you had a federal government that was really devoted to the welfare of the poor or the middle class. And then liberals and libertarians would have a disagreement. Liberals would say, I think it's important that, you know, people who are elderly not be left to fend for themselves, and I don't want to be in a society where they do, and I think we should collectively support them. And libertarians could say, well, I don't think that's your choice to make about my money and private charity and all that. But we don't actually have that kind of society. The government doesn't exist and doesn't collect taxes or redistribute wealth to help the poor or the middle class. It does it to forward this corporate cronyism, this merger of government and corporations. And when you saw that best is what, in the wake of the financial crisis, what the government did was it took $800 billion and it could have used it to alleviate people who had fallen behind on their homes and were getting foreclosed. It could have done it for people who were unemployed, but it didn't. It took that $800 billion and it gave it to the largest banks, the people who essentially own the government and assert power over it. And interestingly, the movement on the right, which is the Tea Party movement, was a reaction in large part to opposition to the bailout, to that bailout. And opposition on the left, in the form of Occupy movement, was very much about the same thing. It was about the fact that the government had bailed out the banks and then had sought to protect them by not prosecuting them at a time when we're putting more people of ordinary means and who are poor into prison. And so I think you see this merger of interests between liberals and libertarians, where the transfer of wealth from ordinary citizens to the government is a means not of serving some public interest, which is where the debate happens, but of entrenching the people who are in power. And so I do think there's a real relationship between the way the government's economic policies, which are causing great amounts of instability and insecurity for virtually everybody except for people in power, and the civil liberties that we're talking about. I also think there's a relationship in that the government expects there to be lots of instability and unrest because of the economic suffering that these policies are imposing. And a lot of these powers that are being seized and imported domestically are about anticipatorily thinking about ways how to pacify the citizenry and controlling that unrest. And so I think there is a relationship in lots of different ways. And I actually think it's interesting that even in economic realm, you know, it's not surprising to see Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich joining together on civil liberties or terrorism issues or foreign policy, but you saw Ron Paul joining with Dennis Kucinich in denouncing corporate cronyism in the bailout, or Ron Paul joining with Alan Grayson to demand transparency for the Fed, because people on both the right and the left understand that these policies are not for good ends, but for very ignoble ends, for perpetuation of the status quo, for oppression of large groups of people. So I actually think it's an interesting development that even in economic realm, where liberals and libertarians are typically furthest apart, there's now a much greater convergence than there ever was before. So.
And since Glenn brought up the point of Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich, let me leave you with this one little piece of ammunition before we get out of here. If you're on the left and you admire people like Dennis Kucinich, and you're on the right or libertarian and admire Ron or his son Rand Paul, and critics of either say, well, look how far to the right you are. You're all the way on the left with Dennis Kucinich. Or Dennis Kucinich fan, look how far to the left you are. You're on the right with Ron Paul. You tell them, well, John McCain and Hillary Clinton disagree with both of them, and they're right there in the middle. So nobody wants to be on their side, whether you're on the right or left either. But I appreciate you guys being with us tonight. It's been a real pleasure on behalf of Young Americans for Liberty and the Future of Freedom Foundation. Thank you for coming. If you could take those yellow cards and leave them at the table on the way out, we'd certainly appreciate it. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.